Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most defining eras of modern history, the 45-year geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. For nearly half a century, the entire globe basically held its breath. So, how did we get there? Let's trace exactly how this monumental conflict started, how it was fought, and how it finally came to an end.
All right, let's map out our roadmap. We're going to break this massive history down into 5 key phases. An alliance turns cold, drawing the Iron Curtain, the proxy wars, the brink of nuclear war, and finally, the Soviet Union collapses.
Section 1. An alliance turns cold. From World War II allies to global rivals.
You know, during World War II, the US and the USSR actually teamed up to defeat Adolf Hitler. But the second Nazi Germany fell, it became incredibly clear why the mistrust between them was so deep. They just had fundamentally incompatible worldviews. On one side, the United States and its Western allies were firmly rooted in capitalism and democracy. On the other side, the Soviet Union operated on communism and totalitarianism. And both superpowers genuinely believed their ideology was the absolute rightful path for the post-war world.
Well, this growing dispute definitely didn't stay quiet for long. By 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously warned the world of the deepening divide, stating that an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. This iconic phrase really bookends the start of our historical timeline, signaling that the world was officially splitting into 2 opposing camps.
So, what exactly was the Cold War? According to the JFK Presidential Library, it got its name because the US and the Soviet Union largely avoided a direct armed confrontation, or what we'd call a hot war. Instead, these 2 superpowers continually antagonized each other through political maneuvering, espionage, propaganda, military coalitions, economic aid, and proxy wars. It was essentially a battle fought in the shadows, using other nations as the chessboard.
Section 2. Drawing the Iron Curtain. Containment and blockades.
This whole era was defined by a rapid, intense, tit-for-tat escalation. Back in 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin agreed to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, but he completely broke that agreement, instead installing a vast buffer zone of communist regimes between Western Europe and Mother Russia. In response, U.S. President Harry Truman enacted a policy of containment, basically aiming to prevent the Soviets from exporting their ideology any further. The U.S. countered by offering massive economic assistance through the Marshall Plan in 1948 and by merging their German occupation zones. Feeling threatened by this Western consolidation in Germany, Stalin retaliated by cutting off all highway and railroad traffic into Berlin. The Berlin blockade had officially begun.
Now, what's absolutely crucial to understand here is the sheer scale of the Western reaction. Berlin was sitting deep inside Soviet territory, and West Berliners suddenly faced immediate starvation and severe shortages. The Western allies obviously didn't want to abandon Berlin and look weak, but they also really didn't want to start World War III. Their solution? The Berlin Airlift. For 324 days, they delivered roughly 13,000 tons of supplies from the air every single day. It was a massive, unprecedented logistical success. They prevented starvation without firing a single shot, ultimately forcing Stalin to call off the blockade in 1949.
Section 3. The Proxy Wars. Shifting the battleground.
While Europe sat divided, this struggle for global influence quickly shifted over into Asia, and there the Cold War turned very, very hot. The conflicting missions, either stopping or expanding communism, led directly to the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The staggering human and economic toll of these conflicts is really hard to overstate. In Korea, the U.S. spent about $67 billion, resulting in the deaths of over 36,000 U.S. troops, only to end in an armistice that simply kept the country divided. Then in Vietnam, over 2.5 million U.S. soldiers deployed across several decades. These weren't abstract ideological debates. They were devastating physical conflicts heavily fueled by superpower resources.
Working behind the scenes, the Soviet Union was pouring absolutely immense resources into securing communist victories. They shipped huge amounts of military hardware to North Korea and their Chinese allies, stuff like submachine guns, medium tanks, and advanced MiG-15 jet fighters. In Vietnam, Soviet economic aid to the North is estimated to have been somewhere between $3.6 billion and $8 billion. This massive influx of weapons and funds highly motivated communist guerrilla fighters like the Viet Cong to keep pushing forward, easily resupplying their forces through networks like the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Meanwhile, on the flip side of this proxy conflict, U.S. efforts in Vietnam began to severely crumble. Despite having a formidable, highly equipped military presence, troop morale rapidly waned.
Back home in the States, a robust anti-war movement took hold, leading to widespread, intense protests. The toll got so heavy that over 503,000 U.S. military personnel eventually deserted. Ultimately, the U.S. signed a peace agreement in 1973 and withdrew entirely. This led straight to the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, when South Vietnam surrendered and fell completely under communist control.
Section 4. The brink of nuclear war. Escalation in the 1960s.
Now, let's shift focus to the most terrifying moments of this entire decades-long struggle, the times when the fate of the world literally hung in the balance. The tension spiked directly in Berlin. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev desperately wanted the Western powers out, partly because a massive wave of skilled East Germans were fleeing straight into capitalist West Berlin. When the U.S. flat-out refused to leave, East Germany responded by building the infamous Berlin Wall. Tensions boiled over when East German guards began blocking Allied access, leading to a legendary standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. We're talking about a heavily armed, 16-hour tank standoff directly between U.S. and USSR forces. Fortunately, tense back-channel negotiations between President John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to defuse the situation, and the tanks finally backed down. But then, just 1 year later, in 1962, they faced off again in an even deadlier game of chicken, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev boldly positioned nuclear missiles in Cuba, putting them dangerously close to the U.S. mainland. Kennedy retaliated with a strict naval blockade, and Soviet ships sailed right up to the edge of it. The whole world watched, terrified, genuinely fearing we were on the absolute brink of nuclear war. This crisis was finally resolved through a very specific three-part deal. Khrushchev agreed to pull the missiles out, Kennedy publicly pledged not to invade Cuba, and, crucially, Kennedy made a secret, quiet deal to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey.
Section 5. The Soviet Union collapses. The economic takedown.
After a period of somewhat improved relations in the 1970s, which was known as détente, tensions flared right back up in the 1980s. U.S. President Ronald Reagan decided to take a much more aggressive approach. Instead of just fighting endless proxy wars, he targeted the Soviet Union right in its Achilles heel, its completely stagnant economy, a place where productivity growth had actually fallen below zero. Reagan's multi-pronged strategy was designed to systematically cripple them financially. He massively boosted U.S. military spending, worked hard to isolate the Soviet economy from the rest of the globe, and helped drive global oil prices down to their lowest levels in decades.
The sheer velocity of this financial pressure was staggering. To put it into perspective, in a single year, U.S. defense spending soared, jumping from $214 billion in 1982 to a massive $258 billion by 1983. Reagan was deliberately drawing the Soviets into an incredibly expensive arms race. He was forcing them to try and keep up with the development of brand new U.S. weapons, like the stealth bomber. It was a game their failing economies simply couldn't afford to play.
This pressure was honestly suffocating. High-tech U.S. plans, especially the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, forced the Soviet Union into a corner where they had to realize they just couldn't compete anymore. International relations experts note that this overwhelming pressure persuaded the Soviets to bid for a major de-escalation of the arms race. Combined with plummeting oil revenues, which the Soviets desperately relied upon just to remain solvent, the Soviet economy effectively began to crumble from the inside out.
And as the economic foundations cracked, the ideological ones quickly followed. Inside the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced new policies of glasnost and perestroika, allowing for a level of openness that hadn't been seen before. Meanwhile, fierce opposition to Soviet policies grew rapidly across Eastern Europe. Capitalizing on this momentum, Reagan stood right before the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and issued his famous challenge directly to Gorbachev: tear down this wall. It was a massive, defining moment that highlighted the imminent breaking point of the entire Cold War.
From that moment, the collapse happened with breathtaking speed. In 1999, regular citizens took matters into their own hands, literally using picks, hammers, bulldozers, and cranes to physically destroy the Berlin Wall. The Iron Curtain had finally fallen. Just 2 short years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved into independent nations. And with that official dissolution, the 45-year global struggle known as the Cold War quietly came to an end. Which brings us to the end of our timeline and leaves us with a highly provocative question drawn straight from our source material today. Do you think the Cold War is really over? When you look closely at modern geopolitical maneuvering, international espionage, and proxy conflicts happening right now, are we just seeing echoes of this 45-year struggle, or is it something entirely new? Take a moment to think about the lasting, global impacts of everything we've just mapped out. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.